It was in a sodden field like this in the South Staffordshire mining community of Cheslyn Hay that a murder that gripped the nation, in fact the world, unfolded. An unlikely setting, an unlikely murder, a murder that involved everything. Money, conspiracy theories, even links to a royal family. This really was a whodunit that still baffles people today. It was a murder that had its roots 70 miles away from here, in Manchester. And the victim, Adnan Abdul Hasim Al-Sani, was no ordinary victim of violent crime. He was Midas rich. He was a former banker from Kuwait. He mixed in high circles. He had an unquenchable passion for casinos, yet he met a horrific end. A horrific end, by who we still do not know. It has all the hallmarks of a professional hit. Let us start from the beginning. I, as a journalist working in the area, was in the middle of this case from the very beginning. It unfolded on a cold morning in January 1993, when a former school caretaker, Roy Jones, walking his spaniel Mickey, came across a grisly discovery. There, embedded in the mud of a field just like this, was what he thought at first was a case ball. The dog moved round it, sniffed round it. He took a closer inspection. He thought it was a case ball, then he thought it was a sheep's head. Then, to his horror, he realised he was looking at the charred remains of a human head.
Crimes like this are actually more common than you might imagine. And Staffordshire and Derbyshire actually have quite a long tradition of headless bodies being found or heads being found in the countryside. I'm not saying there's anything sinister going on in those two counties, but body parts turning up and then forming a criminal investigation happens a lot more than you would think. In terms of the impact this has had on the local community, it can be quite targeted and quite a feature of interest. So what you often find is, depending on the location, the headless body, or the body is sometimes given a nickname, Headless Fred, Fred the Head. And that's a way, of course, for communities and kids to kind of downplay it and, not be worried about the darkness on the edge of town, which for many people this represents. It often means, of course, that the town or village or the community is in the spotlight for a little while, but it can also arouse a lot of suspicion. So in the case of Mr. Al-Said, the individual who found his head, who was a retired school caretaker, he found the head while he was walking his dog in the fields. And of course, for a moment, he was under suspicion by the police and he was interviewed, and his family were also questioned whilst he was helping the police with the inquiries to make sure that it wasn't a homicide that he was involved in personally. He was completely innocent. But that just shows you that the police have to be incredibly thorough. They have to avoid ruling anything out too soon, and they have to follow all possible avenues. And when you have a single body part found in a rural area, there are lots of avenues that need to be followed up.
In the end, a forensic artist from Manchester University, Richard Neves, was brought in to reconstruct that badly butchered head. The clay model went on display in April of '94, and it paid almost immediate dividends. A lawyer who had worked with Al-Sani recognised the face and alerted police. They at last had a clue. But from there, the details became more and more baffling, more and more sinister. Al-Sani, it appears, lived in a twilight world. He's affluent, hugely affluent, but secretive in his dealings. They discovered his last sighting was on December the 14th at a swank restaurant close to his Maida Vale, London apartment. He was dining with a business colleague. On December the 15th, he missed a key business meeting. Yet strangely, nobody officially reported him missing until January of that year. That seems a long time for a man in high finance, a man dealing in very big business circles. Not until January did someone wave a red flag.
A big advantage that the police have in trying to make such identifications in contemporary times, of course, is digital technology. Almost everybody has a mobile phone. They live through that phone, and those phones are really useful in helping to identify individuals or associates of the individual who may be missing or presumed dead. And everybody leaves a digital footpath that connects people to lots of other people. Back in the 1990s, when this case happened in late 93, there were no mobile phones, there was no internet technology. So if you have a disfigured body part and you've got to sort out the identity and work out how it got there, it's an almost impossible task. One thing the police did have at the time was using facial reconstruction. And when you look into this case, you actually find that facial reconstruction is a technique that homicide detectives have used a lot more than you would imagine in many cases like this. And it proves to be a scientific art that is a lot more successful than you might think. So reconstructing somebody's face based on a skull or partial remains that are found.
What was the motive for this? Well, to understand the motive, we have to look deeper at Al-Sani, a man born into wealth. His family were very, very powerful in Kuwait. They owned the biggest hotel in Kuwait. They also had a chain of hotels and construction interests. They had wealth. They were connected to the Kuwait royal family. Al-Sani was a multimillionaire from the beginning. Rumours surfaced. The Guardian newspaper claimed that Al-Sani was forced to leave Kuwait in '82 after the collapse of an unofficial stock market, which left a paper trail of debt amounting to billions upon billions. What he did then, we do not know, really. There was talk, certainly in the Italian media, that he simply became bored with his lifestyle over here and started to dabble in dangerous things. Rumours surfaced that some of those dark dealings might have been bold arms. We simply don't know. We simply do not know. What we do know is that shortly after that head, the reconstruction of that head was made public, a former business associate of Al-Sani was shot in the streets in London. Police did not think that was significant. They did not see a link. But what it was also claimed in national newspapers over here was that he and Al-Sani had been involved in a bitter court battle over finances. Al-Sani was a man with secrets, a man who maybe walked close to the line. His finances were not what they were when he met his demise. And it was a brutal demise. It was a brutal demise. Whoever did it went out of their way to conceal his identity. There was initially talk that his head had been severed with a ceremonial Arabic sword. Police later denied that.
Having the job of trying to identify what happened to a crime victim who was high profile can be both a blessing and a curse. The advantage of having a high-profile victim, of course, is that many people may recognize the victim and they may have spotted them or seen them or had some interaction where they can help the police place where the victim was at a certain time. That can be invaluable to an investigation. The other problem with high-profile victims, though, is that the higher the profile, the greater the potential for more people who would wish them harm or want to do them some damage. So it doesn't help the detectives if you've got a high-profile victim, because there could be hundreds or thousands of people who may have disliked that high-profile individual, and that makes the task of tracking a lead down even more arduous. It involves more legwork, more detectives, more paperwork and administration, and that can really tie up and slow down an investigation. And as you know, these things need to be identified and investigated quickly. Stories like this drop out of the news and they become replaced by other stories, so the detectives really need to make advances in the early stages of these investigations while it's still news. So the police, as always, have a very difficult job of trying to keep the story in the headlines to keep people awake and paying attention, and hopefully just that one lead will help them. But high-profile victims of crime can also mean that there's a lot of finances involved, a lot of power and influence, and some people might be frightened of coming forward because of connections or fear of reprisals. So a high-profile victim can be both a blessing and a curse when trying to solve out what happened to somebody.
Al-Sani was a man with secrets. A man who maybe walked close to the line. His finances were not what they were when he met his demise. And it was a brutal demise. It was a brutal demise. Whoever did it went out of their way to conceal his identity. There was initially talk that his head had been severed with a ceremonial Arabic sword. Police later denied that. His face had been slashed so that any features were completely destroyed. The body and head left in different areas. Someone went out of their way to make sure Al-Sani paid for something, some slight, and we still don't know what. We still don't know what. Al-Sani was in life a very powerful man. It appears he had even more powerful enemies. The facts are hard to believe, and in fact it remains the most gripping case that I was involved in. The drama began on December 17th, 1993, under the arches of Piccadilly Railway Station in Manchester. There, Christmas shoppers discovered a smouldering body, badly battered, clad only in underpants. This was the start. This was the start of a case that would meander and mutate and spawn many, many conspiracy theories. 6 weeks later, Roy Jones made the almost unbelievable discovery of a head. DNA analysis eventually matched the head to the torso. And detectives, leading the case, realised the head had been tossed like garbage, like litter, out of the window of a car travelling along the M6. The murder had not taken place here, but remains had been scattered here. This was a whodunit that baffled police, who at first described the crime as meticulous but non-professional. As further information came to light, it became obvious it was very professional. This had all the hallmarks of a hit. It took many, many months for the victim to be identified.
What we need to remember in this investigation is what happened to Mr. Al-Said. All we know is that he was somehow located in Manchester when he was killed, and he was only wearing his underwear. His body was then burned, his head was then removed, and his head was attacked and lacerated, probably to hide his details and to make identification harder. For psychologists, the separation of body parts, particularly decapitation, could have some psychological meaning, but it's also likely that it's not of deep psychological meaning, but it's simple practicality. In cases where there has been a targeted assassination or a hit, sometimes the head is offered as proof that the individual has been killed, and that might be necessary before full payment is made. So it could be highly likely in a case where someone has been targeted and murdered for money, that the attackers and the murderers need to provide the head or some other form of ID to complete the deal and the payment. Obviously, transporting a head is a lot cleaner and safer than trying to transport a body. So that could explain why the head was removed and taken from where the body was eventually left and found. What's key in the investigation, of course, is that Mr. Al-Said was found wearing his underwear. What we do know is that when individuals are sometimes captured and held against their will and sometimes tortured, those victims are more compliant when they are effectively naked or they have their clothing removed, but their underwear is kept on. Now, this may be that the captors are trying to avoid any suggestion that there was a sexual motive on their behalf. They don't want people to think that this was a sex crime. They want people to know that this was possibly business. But the removal of clothing usually means that the victim, the captive, is more compliant and will do what the captors want. What happened to the clothing could also be really important. How was it removed? What was done with it? Was it found at the location where the body was also found? But nudity of the victim is key in trying to understand the relationship between the victim and their captors.
It was in December the 14th at a swank restaurant close to his Maida Vale, London apartment. He was dining with a business colleague. On December the 15th, he missed a key business meeting. Yet strangely, nobody officially reported him missing until January of that year. That seems a long time for a man in high finance, a man dealing in very big business circles. Not until January did someone wave a red flag. A search of his apartment showed there had been no struggle inside it. The place was neat and tidy. Yet strangely, 6 boxes were missing. 6 boxes containing papers involved in stocks and shares. That was the only thing missing.
So in terms of motives, some things became quite clear quite quickly. He was very wealthy and his movements were not necessarily transparent. This, of course, would have been a big potential motive for investigators: financial gain. His personal life was very simple and straightforward. There seemed to be no romantic complications or affairs or romantic skeletons in any closet. So it seemed quite apparent to the investigators early on that it could have been financially motivated more than anything else. At the time of Mr. Al-Said's disappearance, the investigators found that he was also involved in legal proceedings with one of his former friends, and he was taking his former friend to court for several £1,000s. I mean, this was big money, and of course that could have been a motive that the police would have investigated as a natural line of inquiry.
I'll never forget the morning when news of the discovery of the head filtered through to the newsroom of the weekly paper, where I then served as editor. It began with a phone call from a parish council contact who wanted to talk about tree preservation orders, hedgerows, the state of potholes. Then at the side he laughed and said, by the way, the missus reckons they've found a head in playing fields close to Cheslyn Hay School. He said, but I shouldn't take you to notice. It's probably a cabbage now in there. I didn't. It was only later that news started to come through from official sources. And as macabre it sounds, it was a discovery that for many, many months spawned some gallows humour amongst pupils at the schools in this village. All of a sudden the joke was, we'll take you to see the head. And they didn't mean the headmaster.
For some reason, and I can never really track this back through the case records, but it became a bit of a myth. The notion that Mr. Al-Said's body was tossed from a moving vehicle on the southbound M6 and just discarded casually like that gives the story quite a mythological element. The truth is, however, that Mr. Al-Said's body was found in a dead-end country lane, and it was at least a quarter of a mile from the M6. So there's no truth to the myth that his body was thrown from a vehicle. But that kind of callous element is one of the reasons why the story has such a mythological fascination. The reality is that where his head was found was in some bushes in a dead-end country lane near some school playing fields, in fact, just on the border. So the truth is a little bit more boring, is that someone had to go up that disused lane to deposit that head and then go back again. That doesn't sound as interesting as the head being tossed from a moving vehicle. But that could also be one of the reasons why this has never been solved, because people are looking in the wrong direction for the culprit. There could have been some good vehicle evidence, some possible sightings of suspicious activity in that country lane at the time that the police might have found beneficial. But if the story is the head was tossed on the motorway, then people are going to be looking or not looking for what might have happened at the time in that specific location.
Who killed Al-Sani? You tell me. You tell me. Was the killer from Kuwait? Did he do what he was paid to do and then return? Or did Al-Sani make powerful enemies in this country? So much of his life is shrouded in a mist of secrecy that we simply don't know. His movements are not well charted. What was he into? What was he doing? Why were those papers stolen from his apartment? We simply don't know. It is a whodunit of global proportions, and it is a whodunit that after so many years will remain unsolved.